Okay, well, so hi everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. We're really excited to be able to share with you a web hub that we've developed for fishing communities in the Northeast US. Before we start the webinar, there's just a couple of things that I wanted to note. So we're going to be running this talk for the next half an hour to 40 minutes with various project members. And then we'll have some time for Q&A. So really would love to hear your thoughts and feedback about that. You can ask questions during the presentation. You can put them in the Q&A chat that you'll see in the bottom of your screen or afterwards in the chat. You can also raise your hand at the end of the session and ask the question yourself if you'd like to. Please remember to stay muted during the presentation. And just to note that we're recording this session and it will be available online after this event. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kathy, who will introduce us to sort of the context and motivations for this work before all of us present.
Hi, everyone. As Kat said, thank you all for joining us today and for your interest in this topic. Next slide, Kat, please. So although you see a few of us here on the screen today and a few people will be presenting this webinar, I want to acknowledge that this is actually representing work that has been done by a much larger group of people and has been funded by the Climate Program Office at NOAA through their Coastal and Ocean Climate Applications Program across several grants over the past 6 or so years. So we've had a lot of contributions from participants here at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, important collaborations with NOAA scientists at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, as well as the Physical Sciences Lab, and input from a number of external reviewers that have shaped the website that we're going to be presenting today. So we appreciate all of these contributions. Next slide. Just to give you a bit of an introduction to who we are, because I know some folks are joining from outside of Maine and outside of this region. The core project team behind this work works at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. GMRI is based in Portland, Maine, and is an independent marine nonprofit. We are a nonpartisan organization that supports the Gulf of Maine ecosystem and the communities that depend on it. Our overall mission is to develop and deliver collaborative solutions to global ocean challenges. Those challenges center on 4 major focus areas, including healthy ocean ecosystems, seafood sustainability, thriving blue economies, as well as climate change. So clearly, these are all global issues. Our work is concentrated here in the Gulf of Maine and Northeast US, but makes connections to broader global efforts and creates feedbacks between local and global concerns. So next slide, please. Obviously here in the Northeast region of the US, as well as around the world, we are facing multiple climate risk and rapid changes in terms of many climate conditions and downstream effects that we experience. Warming ocean temperatures are an important concern here in the Northeast US. Sea level rise and increasing storminess are concerns across the world. And there are a number of other changes that we are experiencing with climate change, including physical and chemical changes, as well as ecosystem changes like altered species interactions and invasive species moving into new areas. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned warming ocean temperatures as a particular concern in this region because the Northeast Shelf, which extends from Maine down to Cape Hatteras in North Carolina, has been warming 2.5 times faster than the global average of warming across the world's oceans. In particular, since an oceanographic regime shift around 2008, we have experienced in sort of a new stanza of warm temperatures here in the Northeast region, where temperatures from 2010 through present have been much warmer than the prior decades. This is having ramifications across the ecosystem and is a focus of the work that we will be presenting on the Resource Hub as we walk through certain steps of that. Next slide, please. So some of those impacts relate to fisheries and to the broader seafood economy. For a number of important fish stocks and invertebrate stocks in the region, like northern shrimp, lobster, and cod, we've seen declines in productivity that have been occurring as temperatures have been rising. We've also seen shifts in a number of shifts in the distribution of a number of species as they seek favorable conditions and conditions that they prefer. And we're seeing impacts not just within the ecosystem, but across the supply chain as these changes to species that are supporting commercial fisheries also influence the operations of shoreside businesses, whether that be dealers, processors, or consumers in the seafood supply chain. Next slide. And as these changes are occurring, we're also seeing responses in the form of adapting in a variety of ways and at a variety of scales. So individual harvesters might be diversifying or changing the species they target or diversifying their livelihoods. We are seeing changes in operations and infrastructure for seafood businesses, as well as broader community infrastructure needs, as well as local initiatives like local seafood marketing to support fisheries. Because in many fishing communities, fisheries are an important contributor to employment and to the broader economy. So there's an interplay there between fisheries that may occur over broader scales and how those impacts intersect at a community scale. Next slide. So our motivations for creating this resource hub really stems from multiple projects that we've been involved in over the past 6 or so years, looking at projected changes in commercially fished species, the fisheries for those species and communities that are heavily invested in and connected with those fisheries, and adaptation strategies that might support vibrant and resilient fisheries in the future. These projects have involved quantitative analyses and modeling of different species, social science methods such as interviews and focus groups in different communities to understand the changes they're experiencing and how they're responding, as well as broader community engagement activities such as workshops to get broader input and have broader interaction with some of the information that we've been developing. And through this work, we've realized that adaptation planning requires complex forward-looking information. And the focus here on forward-looking is really important. That information needs to cover multiple perspectives and multiple disciplines, and it needs to be available at scales that are relevant to community decisions and in accessible formats. At the same time, although this is an incredible need, we recognize that many communities have limited resources, expertise, and capacity to develop all of this information themselves. So through this resource hub, next slide, please, Kat, we are striving to provide some additional information and resources that can be useful at a community scale as different fishing communities pursue adaptation and resilience planning efforts. This information is produced at locally relevant scales to be sort of focused on fisheries in particular communities. And we've drawn in also examples of how fishery stakeholders and communities are adapting to provide some more concrete examples that are particularly relevant to fisheries. And then we've embedded this information into a broader adaptation planning framework. Our target audience for this resource hub is members of fishing communities, people who may be involved in local planning. This might be through formal jobs, but also others who are involved in informal ways through volunteer capacities, perhaps, as well as partners and partner organizations that are working with these communities to support adaptation and resilience planning. So with that, we are going to shift into providing an overview of what is in the Resource Hub, its key components, as well as some of the particular elements, content within the hub. Dr. Kat Maltby, who's a social scientist here at GMRI, will be leading the overview. We'll also have contributions from Adam Kimberling and Carly Lovis, who are research associates here. And we do have Dr. Andrew Allen with us today, who will be available to elaborate on the species distribution modeling that supports part of the Resource Hub. So with that, I want to shift to Kat, who will talk through the sort of structure and major elements of the hub.
Yeah, so thank you, Kathy. Hi everyone. So building on what Kathy was just saying, we really felt that a resource hub would be an effective way for us to both bring together the different outputs from the projects that we've been involved in, and also to try and fill a need regarding communities needing to plan for their adaptation. Whilst we were kind of thinking about how to develop this site, we found that there's been a lot of resources out there regarding climate change generally, or focused on coasts or coastal communities or specific hazards such as sea level rise, or on fisheries kind of generally, things like data dashboards that have species distributions currently, but not necessarily mapping future conditions. And so importantly, finding that fishing community scale resources were sort of falling through that gap. A fun challenge of the sort of resource hub, and something that, motivates us to work in this area is that fishing communities are all unique and have different kind of needs and capacities. And so through the creation of this hub, we've been trying to meet the needs of different individuals involved in planning and implementing adaptation in those different communities. So those bubbles there on the slide just kind of show the range of different stakeholders that can be involved with planning for adaptation. And so the information that we've been providing is kind of both trying to get a high level understanding for some folks that just need that, as well as developing resources that allow kind of deeper dives into some specific topics. So the resource hub is framed around a decision-making cycle that's used quite frequently in the literature and in other toolkits. We were inspired by the US Climate Resilience Toolkit in particular, and the US National Climate Assessment. They both do really great jobs of distilling climate science and complex information into more accessible formats, as well as guiding folks through some of the issues in sort of stepwise manners. So the framework we've used is on that diagram there. We've split it into three kind of key areas. So the first is understanding. So helping orientate people to some of the hazards and impacts that might be facing fishing communities, as well as thinking about some of the goals of adaptation planning. Then moving into the second stage, which is more about planning. So thinking through some of the adaptation options and actions that might be applicable. And then thirdly, into the managing stage. So implementing some of those actions and the sort of things to think about doing that, as well as some of the monitoring and evaluation implications. So again, kind of providing guiding text as well as subject-specific and community-level reports. And importantly, recognizing that there are resources out there and toolkits already, and so linking people to those where appropriate in the site as well. So this is kind of what the resource hub looks like when you first enter the site, adapting that framework into this sort of adaptation planning pathway. So really hoping that people work sequentially through the site, but also you can, of course, access it as individual standalone pages. So diving in, so the first part of the site is really about helping orientate people to think about understanding the problem and problems of adaptation planning and sort of goal setting, and thinking about some of those initial considerations. And we recognize that some communities might be further along in adaptation planning than others, but kind of it's really about helping to step back and think about some of the processes involved in planning itself. So within this section, we have information about outlining motivations and goals for adaptation actions kind of upfront. So why is adaptation important for a particular community? What is the focus of adaptation on, and who is adaptation hoping to serve or support? This could also involve thinking about community values and priorities to ensure that any adaptation actions are really helping to contribute to a broader vision that the community might have regarding its future. We also highlight the importance of considering different dimensions of the fishery or community, whether those be ecological, social, economic, or governance. And from a community perspective in particular, focusing some of the key elements, actors, and relationships. So fisheries are kind of complex systems, and communities are obviously composed of lots of different parts, and it can be quite overwhelming to think about where even to start conducting adaptation actions or partitioning resources to different areas. And so thinking about what be some of the lower hanging fruits, and parts of the system to really direct action initially can be valuable. And then finally, we also encourage people to think about the processes that will be involved in planning and implementing adaptation, specifically around kind of the types of stakeholder engagement that might be used, how are different types of people and groups being brought to the table, and their voices heard in decisions around their futures, and importantly, thinking about some of the equity implications of that. So I'll hand over to Adam Kemberling now, who will kind of talk about some of the climate hazards that the site talks about.
Great, thank you, Kat. While climate change is directly the result of all composition of the ocean and atmosphere, physical changes, climate hazards for both marine species and communities. Within the context of marine systems, examples of two such hazards are ocean warming and ocean acidification. The warming in the Northeast US that Kathy mentioned has increased the frequency and duration of marine heat waves, which adversely affect marine species. This impacts how species navigate the marine environment as they seek their preferred conditions. Ocean acidification is a hazard of particular concern for shell-forming marine species, so clams, mussels, etc. Ocean acidity interferes with the ability of these species to produce their shells or exoskeletons and grow. This in turn can lead to weaker shells, slower growth, disease, and higher vulnerability to predators. Next slide, please. Our work within the Resource Hub, which projects forward in time, uses data from climate scenarios to emulate potential future conditions. The IPC uses these scenarios, and they are modeled representations of possible future states. Scenarios are useful for forming expectations around when different conditions might be expected based on decisions around climate change mitigation. Using sea bottom temperature as an example, we can see that these two potential futures diverge before 2050, with future conditions becoming more different dependent on which industrial policy decisions we make and the amount of warming experienced as a consequence. By using these tools thoughtfully, we can contextualize expectations on physical changes to the marine environment for different regional communities. With that, I'm now going to pass it over to Carly, and she's going to go over how we've accomplished this and localized impacts for the use in our community reports.
All right, thank you, Adam. Can you hear me? I just blipped for a second. Okay, thank you. Thank you. And thanks, Adam. The next step in our adaptation pathway and the next page on the Resource Hub is understanding fisheries climate impacts. To frame and contextualize the climate change impacts on coastal fisheries, we've developed reports, which are these 4 pages shown here on the left, for 16 communities ranging from Stonington, Maine to Newport News, Virginia. The reports are designed to highlight current landings, how landings of historically important species have changed, how ocean temperatures may change, and how those changes may impact species biomass within a community's fishing area. Next slide, please. In order to capture the diversity of fisheries across the Northeast, we selected a number of ports of various sizes and types of landings, ranging from ports landing a wide range of species to single species dependent ports. Each report is available for download on the Understanding Fisheries Climate Impacts page of the Resource Hub. Simply scroll down the page to the map, hover over the community of interest, and click the link to view the report. So using New Bedford as an example, let's walk through the major components found in each report. Using dealer data from the Greater Atlantic Regional Fisheries Office, or GARFO, we averaged the annual value and volume of landings by species in each port from 2012 to 2021 to highlight the more recent trends in landings. Then to understand overall changes in landings, we have the aggregate landed volume and value from 1985 to 2021. It's important to note that this data from GARFO is subject to certain confidentiality restrictions and therefore may not be fully representative of all the landings within a given port. But it still gives us a good general understanding of what species are important. In order to represent past changes in fisheries and previous examples of adapting to change, we highlighted 3 to 6 important species for each community, depending on the size of the port, that have experienced periods of growth and decline already. And while many of these communities have been able to adapt to these changes historically, climate change is really furthering the need for adaptation. So using the Northeast Fisheries Science Center spring and fall bottom trawl survey data, we can understand how the biomass of a particular species relates to bottom temperature, surface temperature, and depth. With ocean temperature projections that Adam previously mentioned, we can project the density of a particular species across the Northeast Trawl survey area. Using non-confidential vessel trip report footprints or statistical areas, depending on the size of the community and confidentiality restrictions, we crop the biomass projections and then can gain a rough estimate of what may be available in the future where people have previously fished. We can further contextualize these changes by assessing relative change in biomass at various levels of warming, which may occur in the future. If you have any other questions about species distribution models, Andrew Allen, who developed these models, is on the panel and will be able to answer any of your questions during the Q&A session following the presentation. Next slide, please. Within the reports themselves, we chose to show projections of the same important species that we previously showed, as well as species that showed an increase in relative abundance within the area. We showcase these changes to provide insight into what may happen in the near future and highlight opportunities for adaptation and resilience. And now I will hand it back to Kat, who will talk further about adaptation options.
Great, so thank you, Adam and Carly. Yeah, so building on the information that they were just describing regarding impacts and hazards, the next part of the Resource Hub is really focused on helping provide information on what can you do about it. So in this section, Planning for Change, we're really there to describe different types of adaptation actions and options that are available. It wasn't really appropriate for us to prescribe particular actions to different communities, as that of course depends on different needs and contexts. And so we really just outline a range of these options at multiple scales. And so this is derived from information that we collected both from individuals at varying fishing communities in the Northeast region, as well as some of the kind of broader literature and information that's available. So adaptation options can span a range of timescales, kind of from more short-term urgent needs through to, and importantly, those longer-term horizons and trends that also need to be tackled. There's also differences in kind of scale, more spatially within fishing communities. So individual changes at the harvester level through to industry and fishery changes, things like supply chains or dealers, processors, through to the community scale, so particular community groups, groups of interest and fishing adjacent businesses. And then more broadly, governance and management changes as well. And importantly, changes at those levels are really critically needed as they can often affect the outcomes of adaptation and the options available at those other scales. as well as outlining some of the actions that can be at those different scales. We also highlight some of the considerations that are needed when thinking about which adaptation options to choose from. This includes thinking about the potential trade-offs from ecological, social, or economic perspectives, and alongside that, some of the equity impacts. So climate change not only differentially impacts people, but also the interventions and actions that we choose to buffer some of those impacts can also have equity implications. To help inform some of the information about trade-offs and equity impacts, using a diverse knowledge base and incorporating different types of knowledge is really important. So not just Western science, but other knowledge forms such as local ecological knowledge or Indigenous knowledge. But critically, that depends on both the permission and the participation of those groups. And then there's also more practical considerations, things like resources and capacities, such as time or funding or staffing, which can also influence what options might be more feasible than others. So I'll just give a couple of examples across those different scales, as that might sound a bit abstract. So for individuals, we can see that there's a bunch of different options available, things like changing target species or fishing locations and times as species availability changes. More kind of potential transformative changes could be things like livelihood diversification, either within or outside of the fishery. And so an example of that we're seeing in Maine is with lobstermen choosing to diversify into kelp farming for some of their off-season, sort of to diversify their catch portfolios. At the kind of next level up, so industry and fishery sort of level, so adjustments could be made in business operations or on business or waterfront infrastructure, and sort of increasing processing capacities or other supply chain logistics. So an example of that in southern Maine is the southern Maine crab business, which has really been really helpful in providing new processing capacity of Jonah crabs to allow the industry, the lobster industry and other fishermen to sort of utilize that catch, which has typically not been able to be diversified into because of that sort of supply chain bottleneck. At a community scale, there's a range of adjustments that could be developed, sort of shoreside infrastructure, making that being able to buffer future coastal hazards, changes in sort of local seafood marketing and consumption, particularly around sort of underutilized species. There's also efforts that can be undertaken in terms of vulnerability mapping or scenario planning and future visioning. So an example of that is in Point Judith. In Rhode Island, the commercial fishing industry and wider community came together to develop a resilience plan, their blueprint for resilience, to really think about the impacts that they were facing from climate change and some of the actions that they could take, and kind of a broader visioning exercise as well. And then finally, the management and governance level, there's a whole range of different adaptation actions that can occur at this level too. Things like changing permitting structures to allow that diversification into other fisheries, altering harvestable quota amounts as species availability changes, or maybe adjusting fishing seasons in the calendars as different species shift in their sort of timing of key life cycle events. An example of that is the use of dynamic reference points in stock assessments, which can be adjusted for varying harvest levels. So then finally going into the sort of last section of the website, which is around really thinking about the considerations for implementing adaptation actions, some of the monitoring and evaluation implications, and also connecting people to resources that are available in the Northeast from climate change or fisheries specific perspectives. So in this section, we're really trying to help people think through some of the factors that can influence sort of implementing adaptation action. So introducing a barriers and enablers framework that can help people think about the conditions, context that can influence both the effectiveness of adaptation actions and also the feasibility of different actions in those different contexts. And identifying these can be really valuable for helping to determine where to allocate resources or efforts and to develop processes for overcoming barriers or leveraging enablers. And so barriers are those kind of factors that can make it harder to plan and implement adaptation actions, and enablers kind of the opposite, making it easier to plan, maybe expanding adaptation options, or also providing co-benefits. Importantly, barriers and enablers can arise at multiple scales of a community or a fishery system, like I was just describing. And there's a lot of interdependencies and interactions there. So part of this section is really helping people think a bit more holistically about the system as a whole and where issues might arise. So just kind of, again, that might sound a bit abstract, so some more concrete examples based on the work that we've done with community members. So some of the barriers that we've heard about include specialization of fisheries over time. So for example, up in Maine, increasingly becoming dependent on lobster resources. This can kind of limit adaptation options in the short term in terms of different diversification options, but over the longer term might open up opportunities in terms of helping people become more invested in wanting to get involved in decision making and advocate for sort of changes to see in management options and permitting structures to allow that diversification. From an enablers perspective, we also heard a range of things here. In particular, protected working waterfronts was an issue that we heard about. And so that could be either through informal protections, which might be a bit more precarious, but people still appreciated that, or through more formal mechanisms of kind of grandfathering in rights or having current regulations. And so that not only provides people with sort of the access, continued access to working waterfronts, but also allows kind of that breathing space to allow for long-term planning horizons. And so that can open up different adaptation options as well. So really kind of bringing this barriers enablers framework is kind of an iterative cycle that people can work through, both identifying some of those factors might open up different adaptation options that become available, and once those have been thought about, reiterating that kind of cycle. So finally, just some reflections and future directions for the Resource Hub. So we found that it was really useful to bring together different disciplinary outputs through using these broad frameworks that we've derived both from kind of some of the adaptation science as well as social ecological systems literature, and really have helped to kind of translate some of this science into more actionable and accessible formats. Throughout the work, there was a number of different knowledge gaps that were identified. So they're just in that green box there. So these stem from sort of the ecological realm and the fisheries realm. So really the need for more near-term forecasts, fishery-specific implications. There's a lot of unknowns around storms and sea level rise impacts in particular and how that will play out. And really crucially, kind of the multi-stressor effects from all of those different impacts. Thinking more about the social and economic side of the system, there's still a lot we need to know about the types of adaptation needs that communities have, some of those barriers and enablers that can affect their planning and their implementation of adaptation, and also thinking about some of the well-being implications. That's a lot of knowledge gaps, but I would say if I had to pick one, there's a real critical need for monitoring and evaluation resources. There's a real lack of that, I would say, at the moment, specifically for fishing communities. So thinking about, how can we judge the effectiveness of specific adaptation actions? What are the measures and the methods to track progress in where we want to be? And so just ending with some kind of final additions that we hope to bring to the site as time goes on and as more of the work that we're doing comes online. So we're really hoping to develop a data dashboard for species distribution so that people can play around with the data themselves for their communities and have a bit more of an in-depth look. We'd also like to add additional climate hazard information. So our climate centre here is doing work on sea level rise, for example, and working with others as well to understand some of those impacts would be great to bring into the site. Some of the specific fishery case studies, particularly on more of the adaptation side, I think will also be valuable to kind of help make some of those adaptation actions and barriers and enablers a bit more grounded in real world. Of course, they have been grounded in the real world, but they can be quite abstract and difficult to get your head around. So we have work, for example, with the lobster fishery here in Maine and southern New England, which has drilled much more into those aspects. And then finally, we have broader vulnerability reports that our Municipal Climate Action Programme is producing with communities in Maine specifically and bringing them into the Web Hub as well, we hope to do. So just to conclude, our Resource Hub really helps to collate a lot of different types of science into an actionable resource for communities. As I said, we expect the site to evolve as more information and resources are added. So our site is adaptable as much as we're advocating for adaptation in communities. There's also a lot of future challenges regarding knowledge gaps, specifically and critically around monitoring and evaluation, but that shouldn't preclude action. And then finally, we're really open to supporting communities and their partners with more detailed information or resources and really meeting people where they're at with their individual efforts. So yeah, please get in touch with us if you have ideas. So that's the end of our presentation. We'd really love to hear any questions, comments or feedback from you all. So thank you.